Thanks. Right, well, hopefully that's given time for anyone who's going to join time to come in. So I'll get started. So welcome everyone to today's event. This is part of the consultation on the draft urban greening factor guidance. So today we'll be looking at how to apply the UGF to development proposals. So this is session 2 of 3 events. The first one a few weeks ago was a general introduction to the UGF, and the recording of that event should be available on our web pages shortly. This session is looking at applying the UGF to developments, and then the third session will cover some of the same ground, but also look at some UGF issues that are specific to local authorities. So that one's just for London boroughs. We'll circulate all the relevant info after the session. Okay, next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm having a problem now moving the slides on.
Oh no, okay. Do you want, do you think we need someone else to share the presentation or?
Possibly. Sorry about this, everyone. It's not moving on, is it, on your screen or mine?
No. Okay. Sam G, are you able to load up the downloaded version?
Yeah, I can. If you stop sharing the screen.
Sorry, that's
we got it
now. Perhaps
okay.
Sorry about this, everyone.
Sorry. Anyway, looks like we're up and running now. Good, thank you both. So I'll just give you an outline of what we'll be talking about today. So dependent on technological issues, the presentation should last about 45 minutes and we'll follow that with a Q&A session. So we should be finished well before 3:30 at the latest. So the webinar is going to give you a brief introduction to the urban greening policy that we've introduced through the London Plan and to the UGF guidance that we've published for consultation. So we're going to cover how the UGF is applied to developments in London, and in particular how to calculate UGF scores, and how to submit the necessary information as part of the planning application. And then we'll be looking at how greening can be embedded in the design of schemes and the importance of doing that early in the process. We'll also look at how the UGF can be used to deliver biodiversity net gain. So at the end, we'll give you all the information you need to give us some feedback on the consultation, and we're going to wrap up with a Q&A session. So do feel free to ask any questions you've got using the Q&A function as we go. And it's helpful if you use the Q&A rather than the chat, just because it's easier for us to keep track of the questions. Okay, next slide, please. Great, it's all working. So my name is Rhian Williams. I'm part of the London Plan team at the GLA. I'll be giving you a brief intro to the session, and then I'll be passing on to my colleagues Sam Griffiths and Sam Davenport, who will introduce themselves in a moment, and they'll also be here to answer your questions as part of the panel. So we've got a few other colleagues here who are helping and supporting the session today, and just to let you know, the session is being recorded and we'll make it available after the event. Next slide, please. So it's always good to start with this image. With any discussion about greening London, it's helpful to understand the existing green infrastructure network and to think about the context in which we've developed our policies for green infrastructure. So London is a green city. Around half of the surface area is green or blue, and that's in large part thanks to long-standing planning policies which have protected the most valuable open spaces and wildlife habitats in the city. But we know there's some significant inequalities that sit within that overall green picture. So not only in access to more traditional green spaces, but in the overall levels of greenness within neighbourhoods. So some areas benefiting from a lot of street trees and private gardens, and other areas of the city have very low levels of green cover, such as street trees and pocket parks and green roofs. Next slide, please. So if our previous policies have been so successful, why do we need a change? Well, I think firstly, we need to make sure that we're still really strong on protecting our existing green infrastructure and building on those previous approaches. But we know as the city grows and we start to experience the impacts of climate change, that core network of green and natural space will be increasingly under pressure and fragmented as the city densifies around it. And this green space is also going to become even more essential if London's going to be a healthy and livable city into the future. So increasing the amount of greening within the built environment is a real priority for us. And we know that the opportunities to create significant areas of traditional parks and large green spaces are pretty limited. And we've had previous success with previous policies encouraging measures such as the installation of green roofs, but that uptake was the greatest in inner London. And we know that we need all types of major development to include high quality greening. So to meet this challenge, new developments will need to include more green roofs and other types of urban greening, and we need existing buildings, streets and public realm to become greener too. Next slide, please. So just stepping back a few years, to the beginning of this mayor's first term, the production of a new suite of mayoral strategies and plans, so that includes the London Plan and the Environment Strategy, among other documents. It was an opportunity to refine how the city plans for and manages green infrastructure to better reflect the important role that development and regeneration has in helping to ensure the city becomes greener while it grows. So the new London Plan is quite different from the previous one. We've now got a dedicated green infrastructure chapter, and there are also related policies in other sections, including the sustainable infrastructure chapter. So the UGF policy is part of a wider suite of complementary green infrastructure policies, which together protect the most valuable components of the city's green infrastructure network and require new developments to enhance it. Next slide, please. Great. So it's in this context that the London Plan introduces policy G5, urban greening. So the policy sets out a requirement for all new major development, so that's 10 or more homes or 1,000 square metres or more of non-residential floor space, to make greening a fundamental element of site and building design. It also sets a requirement for boroughs to develop UGF scores, and it sets target scores for different development types in the interim. So the UGF isn't the policy itself, but it's a tool and a mechanism that we use to achieve that aim of integrating greening into design. So that just gives you a very, very brief overview of our sort of broad objectives and the context for how this policy is developed, and you'll be hearing more about the detail of that shortly from both the SAMs. But just to say, we've got the London Plan adopted now, so we're now looking at how to make sure policies are implemented. We're working on guidance to support a number of specific policy areas, including the UGF. So if you're interested in seeing any of the other guidance we've published or that we're consulting on at the moment, there'll be a link at the end of the presentation. So the guidance doesn't go through the same process of examination as the London Plan, as it's based on policy that's already been through that. But it is subject to consultation, which the Mayor will take into account before finalising the guidance, and it is a material consideration in planning decisions. So the draft UGF guidance was first published for info earlier in the year. There wasn't time to fit in a full consultation period before the mayoral election, but we wanted to make sure that people could get to grips with the guidance and start using it as soon as possible. So we're now in the consultation phase. The consultation is not about the urban greening policy itself. So the policy and the associated scoring and the targets were discussed at the London Plan examination in public, and the inspector's report on the plan supported that broad approach. But what we're now asking for are views on the detailed guidance to make sure that we're delivering the policy in the most effective way possible. So I'm now going to pass over to Sam, who's going to take us through the UGF in a bit more detail and how it works in practice.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Yeah, my name is Sam Griffiths. I work as a Green Infrastructure Officer within the Environment team at the GLA. Next slide, please. We are going to just take a few minutes now to look at how the UGF is calculated, and this is set out in the policy and then in the guidance document as well. But as we look at these two images here on the screen, we can see that we've got semi-natural vegetation at the top and a green roof, extensive green roof on the second image there. So if we click through a couple of slides, you can see each of those surface cover types have a factor attributed to them. So a factor of 1 for semi-natural vegetation and a factor of 0.7 for extensive green roof. And we simply multiply that factor by the area coverage of those surface cover types. We add the sum of those together and divide it by the total site area, and that gives us our urban greening factor. So next slide, please. So here's an example of a typical landscape master plan that might be submitted. This was quite a number of years ago now, but you can see that this sets out clearly the different kinds of vegetation proposed as part of this scheme. I believe this was in Tower Hamlets. And if we click onto the next slide, we can see how this would be converted into a plan that shows the extent of each surface cover type as defined in the urban greening factor. So for an example, the light blue here being permeable paving, we've got the hedges in the green, ground cover planting in the other off-green colour there. So we can clearly see the extent of each of those, calculating the area. That's multiplied by the factor to give us our overall UGF. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So we haven't touched on this, but it's really important before we go much further to emphasize that the UGF is a tool, but it is not necessarily the policy itself. It evaluates and it quantifies the amount and quality of urban greening that the scheme provides. And what this does is enables decisions, but also conversations to happen between an applicant and the determining authority to set out the appropriate level of greening and to demonstrate any response to conversations that occur throughout that planning process. Next slide, please. So this table 8.2, you may be familiar with from policy G5 within the London Plan. This sets out for all of the different categories. Well, it does set out all the different categories, but the descriptions are broader. And then within Appendix 1 of the guidance that we're consulting on, there's further detail that sets out how each of these different surface cover types are to be measured and what kind of vegetation constitutes each of these surface cover types. So I would encourage you to take a look at Appendix 1, but we're going to run through a few examples in the next few slides. So taking this example here, a photo that happens to have been taken within the Olympic Park, we can see a number of different surface cover types. So starting on the left there are ornamental shrub planting. A few notes on how we calculate this, a few rules of thumb. Firstly, of course, different ornamental areas of planting can include different surface cover types as defined by the UGF. So for an example, it might include some flower-rich perennial planting, it might include some areas of shrub, and it may also include some areas of ground cover. So the rule of thumb there for the UGF is the predominant surface cover type should determine the surface cover factor attributed. So in this instance, a 0.6. You can see also we've highlighted a tree in natural soil. So that is a score of 0.8, and that is in contrast over on the right-hand side, those trees in blossom, trees in unnatural soils that have a less than a third of the ratio to the overall canopy spread of soil volume in the planting pit are awarded a score of 0.6. So we've got two categories for trees in that set. You can see also in the middle, we've got trees in natural soils in the background of the view there, the betula stems you can see. Now it's important to note there that that would be, again, trees in natural soils, even though there is a number of trees there. It wouldn't constitute woodland, it wouldn't constitute therefore semi-natural vegetation, because clearly the design intent there is to allow those stems to be clear, not to develop an understory, not to allow that to succeed into a woodland, but rather the intent is to keep that as a kind of a permeable collection of trees. So therefore that would be awarded a 0.8. And then of course we've got our amenity grassland, which needs little explanation. So that's just one example. We're going to go through a few others. Here's another one, a bit more of a courtyard setting. Again, we've got a few different areas of planting. So where we've got a set aside area of ground cover, that can be awarded its own score of 0.5. Flower-rich perennial planting, once again, we've got 0.7 there. And then anything that is a sealed surface is a score of 0 and therefore makes no contribution. So that's a bit more simple in that example. Next slide, please. Here, so the key messages here is particularly the wildflower in the foreground. So the wildflower planting is awarded a score of 1, so the highest surface cover type. The really important thing to note there is that this isn't just simply species-rich lawn. but a score of 1 should be really reserved for situations where the intention is to create a meadow, either flower rich or certainly species rich. So something that would be cut a number of times a year would not be considered semi-natural vegetation. Something that would be cut on a typical meadow regime would be. So maybe a couple of times a year would constitute semi-natural vegetation. The other one to note here, to draw your attention to, one is the water feature. So areas of open water, which are not chlorinated, would receive a score of 1 as well. However, areas like this one of water features or chlorinated water would receive a score of 0.2. And the other one that I wanted to draw your attention to is the existing tree there with a score of 0.8. The important thing here is existing trees are included in the urban greening factor calculation, and where the trunk, where the stem of the tree is within the site area, the whole canopy should contribute to the UGF. In an instance where we have a tree which is beyond the red line, but the canopy happens to spread over the site, that would not be included. And I just say all of the little rules of thumb that we're running through here are all included in the guidance. We've got one final example on the next slide, which here we see a SUDS feature. And in this instance, it may be that this area of semi-natural grassland shown with a score of 1 there, that arguably is a rain garden, which would receive a score of 0.7. But because the surface cover type, because the grassland on top is awarded a higher score, the higher score takes priority, and therefore this area would receive a score of 1. Above that, we've got our sealed surface again. That doesn't contribute towards the overall UGF. We've got hedgerows in the background, 0.6, and then once again, trees in natural soils or trees in connected pits receiving a score of 0.8. So that's a little bit of a run through of a few examples. And the key thing is to go back to Appendix 1 within the document, and that gives us our rules of thumb. There's also just worth taking a few moments to run through green roofs. We've got 3 different scores for green roofs. You can either be awarded a 0.3 for extensive green roofs, 0.7 for extensive green roofs that have a substrate depth between 60 and 80 millimeters, and then an intensive roof, which we're classifying as a settled depth of at least 150 mil, receives a score of 0.8. So, of course, the depth of substrate can differ across a green roof, but the surface cover type and therefore the factor attributed is determined by the minimum depth. We see quite a number of schemes in London, particularly in the London boroughs with planters on terraces or on roofs. These can be attributed as a green roof. So again, depending on the substrate depth, that would typically be awarded a score of 0.8. We also see quite a lot of applications that include vegetation over structures. So if that is over something like a bike store, for example, that would receive a score as a green roof. But where this is planting, typically amenity lawn, for example, over, say, an underground car park, and therefore at ground level, there's no level change between the ground and the vegetation, that would then be awarded a score of whatever the vegetation type is. So if we have amenity grassland on the ground level that happens to be over an underground car park, that would receive a score of 0.4. And the final point there, biosolar roofs, we see them coming in common, a lot of those, and they are considered very positive. And the perceived conflict between PVs and green roofs shouldn't be a constraint, but rather biosolar roofs are a very welcome design solution there. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to have a think now a little bit more about how we submit the UGF, taking some examples from within the guidance document itself. Next slide. So here is, again, a typical landscape master plan. Now, of course, this would typically be accompanied by a key where we can start to see how the graphics relate to the different types of vegetation proposed. But in order to submit the UGF, that needs to be made really clear. So next slide, please. And this demonstrates how we do that. We take that master plan and apply a color-coded scheme which relates to the urban greening factor table on the right-hand side there to make it very direct link between the plan and therefore the extents proposed to those surface cover types. And after listing the different areas involved, and there is a tool on the GLA's website that you can simply input the areas proposed and the UGF is automatically calculated. And that includes a notes column. And that's a really important part to fill out because there are inevitably some assumptions or some background to these calculations. So for an example, where an area, in this instance in the lime green, is calculated as semi-natural vegetation, in the notes column we can simply add whether this is wildflower or perhaps areas of woodland. And it just helps the person reviewing the case to understand how this has been categorised. You can see also in the bottom of the page there, we've got a typical scale bar, but we also encourage applicants to include some boxes that show a comparative scale, just to help those reviewing the application understand how those areas have been calculated and to do a few checks. So this is the typical drawing that should be submitted for approval. But it's worth noting that this is only really the first half. The second half, or the second element, I should say, of the submission should be some narrative around how urban greening has been embedded or incorporated as a fundamental element of site and building design. And that goes back to Rianne's point earlier, that the urban greening factor is a tool to make sure that policy G5 is being met. But the key thing is to demonstrate that urban greening has been embedded as a fundamental element. So that wider narrative needs to come in the DAS or in a standalone landscape statement. We have received some feedback that sometimes, depending on the complexity of the scheme and the levels involved, the UGF calculations can't fit on one page. That's not a problem. The point is that there should be a standalone drawing or set of drawings for approval, setting out how the UGF has been calculated. Next slide, please. Okay, so speaking about this wider point of the policy, embedding urban greening early, that's what we're going to look at now, and a few just observations about how that can be done, and particularly how that can be demonstrated in that wider narrative in, for example, the design and access statement. So here's a reminder of the policy. The bit in bold is a key bit. Major development proposals should contribute to the greening of London by including urban greening as a fundamental element of site and building design. And the reason for putting that bit in bold is to show that particularly it is not only the site design and therefore the landscape design, but also the building design. And therefore that whoever is calculating the UGF really needs to be working with both the architects, landscape architects, ecologists, civil engineers, to make sure that urban greening is embedded across all elements of the scheme. Next slide, please. So this is really the scenario that the UGF and policy G5 is seeking to avoid, and unfortunately is familiar to, I'm sure, many, where a site, an application site, is considered in isolation, by which we mean we're not looking beyond the red line. It's considered as an island. And then the layout is often defined by the built features alone, so perhaps the parameters of buildings and car parks and infrastructure elements and circulation. And then the bit to be avoided is where we have urban greening or landscape design occupying only the space that is left over. And I appreciate this is a very simplistic example, but this is the kind of scenario that the UGF and policy G5 seeks to avoid. The better solution, on the next slide, please, is what we're really looking to be submitted through the design and access statement, and hopefully the UGF to try and encourage this kind of thinking. So first of all, the site needs to be considered in context. So in this simple mock-up, those two green areas beyond the site boundary might represent local parks or sites of importance for nature conservation. And that needs to be a key element in making sure that urban greening responds to those constraints and opportunities, depending on one's perspective, I suppose. So in this instance, it may be beneficial to create a green link between those two green sites beyond the site boundary. So then the top right image demonstrates the design team setting a project urban greening factor target. Now, if this is in a borough that has chosen to adopt the London Plan targets, and it was a residential development, that would be a minimum of 0.4. There is no maximum target, so a project team may decide to go above and beyond that. But assuming 0.4, the way to approach it is to think, if we are going to meet that target, that would essentially look like covering the whole site in amenity grass. That would be our starting point to meet that target. Now, of course, that is just a starting point. So then once the buildings are added in the bottom left-hand image, using that example, if we want to stay at 0.4, we need to include something of 0.8 across 50% of the space occupied by the buildings. So in this example, we could have 50% of the building roof space or the building footprint covered in intensive green roofs of at least 150 mil, and therefore we are still retaining that 0.4 target, and we know that we're on track to meet that come the final development. And then once all of the other features come in, that's inevitably going to be reduced further. So then it is maximising the extent of greening, but particularly in line with that overarching concept. So in this instance, again, it's a simplistic markup, but it demonstrates that connection between those two green assets beyond the site boundary, following through across the site, including a buffer in the top right-hand corner to buffer that site of nature conservation, and therefore retaining that urban greening factor of 0.4, but also showing that the scheme has responded to its local context. So once again, I appreciate it's a very simple mock-up, but hopefully that starts to demonstrate how the UGF should be approached and used as a tool to demonstrate that urban greening has been embedded as a fundamental element. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Sam, just it's stalled again, so bear with me and I'll see if I can get it to move on. There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of that determining priorities and particularly considering our opportunities for linking into the wider green infrastructure network, there's a few tools available. So in terms of determining priorities for a site and therefore the kind of greening proposed, the GLA's green infrastructure focus map is a key place to go. And this sets out all of the different variables that could be addressed by positive urban greening. So it sets out things like nature conservation, it sets out accessibility to public open space, air quality, noise, cycle flow, all of these different elements that urban greening could address. And it ranks them to demonstrate which of those elements are most in need of intervention. And that can really inform the overarching aims for urban greening delivered on a site. Of course, also, it would be necessary to look at development plan documents or policies maps, proposals maps, any planning maps available, such as the London planning map and green infrastructure strategies. And again, that will help to determine the priorities for any development with regard to urban greening. But I would encourage you to go and have a look at the green infrastructure focus map if you're not familiar with that one already. Next slide, please. So this slide, as we start to come to an end of this section, is really one of the key messages of the UGF. And we know that London is becoming ever more dense. Populations are still set to increase in some boroughs by 20% in 20 years. And therefore, space is at a premium, to say the least. So a key message of the urban greening factor is it is all about quality over quantity. So you can see those two photographs there. The scheme on the left that we looked at earlier, providing a much higher level of urban greening, providing a much broader range of functions than the scheme on the right. Although the space and the key elements are somewhat similar, the quality is vastly improved. And those two graphics on the left demonstrate this in terms of the urban greening factor. So we can see the graphic on the far left shows a scheme with exactly the same quantity of greening or space for greening proposed, but the one on the left achieves half the UGF, a score of 0.21, whereas the one on the right achieves a UGF of 0.42. And that is simply by taking the same spatial constraints, but improving the quality of greening proposed. So incorporating features such as wildflower meadows along the edges of amenity grassland, including intensive green roofs instead of extensive cedar mats, and including tree planting in connected natural soils above areas of grassland. So it's the same area, it's quality over quantity, and that's a key takeaway of the urban greening factor that should be embedded in the scheme. And our final slide in this section demonstrates the kind of thinking that could be incorporated into the life cycle of a scheme using the RIBA work stages. So this is an indicative set of considerations, and it's not prescriptive, but to give you a flavour of the kind of conversations that should occur at each stage. During stage 0, it would be about allocating budget for urban greening from the outset. At stage 1, when we're preparing a brief, it should be setting that UGF target and considering that local context, as we went through earlier. Concept design, that would be defining the parameters required to meet that UGF and making sure that space is protected. Spatial coordination, that may well be agreeing milestone reviews of the urban greening factor progress. So whenever there are different design gates met, the UGF should be reviewed to make sure that we remain on track. Technical design, stage 4, that'll be reviewing opportunities for nature-based solutions. Where can we do things differently in the scheme? Where can we embed greening over a typical grey solution? Stage 5, manufacturing and construction, ensuring that urban greening is implemented in line with those target outcomes. Stage 6, handover, making sure that inspection of urban greening, making sure what's gone in the ground is up to scratch, again, in line with those target outcomes. And then use is really fundamental, albeit a little outside of the UGF, but it's making sure that the scheme maintenance is in line with those target outcomes, making sure that what's proposed to be a wildflower meadow is maintained as such, and therefore can achieve the UGF truly on the site. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Sam Davenport for the next section of our presentation.
Great, thanks very much, Sam. I seem to be running into technical difficulties, which is quite unfortunate, as I'm now about to start my section of the presentation. I'm going to turn my camera off and see if that helps. There seems to be a delay in the slides loading up. Here we go. So thanks, hand over, Sam. Another Sam here. I work in the Green Infrastructure team, also at the GLA, predominantly on policy around urban greening and biodiversity issues. And Sam's spoken, sort of, and Rianne, at sort of length about how urban greening, the urban greening provided through the UGF needs to be considered in terms of the wider context of the site and the benefits that the new greening can be provided, and how it can meet other objectives. And I guess one of the key areas where this is most true is to think about biodiversity and delivering new habitats and overall gains for wildlife through urban greening. And because of this, there's a section of the UGF guidance devoted to sort of how these issues of biodiversity and urban greening can be brought together. So what's the need for urban greening to deliver for biodiversity? Why do we need to think about these things? Well, in the week of COP, we'll be familiar with the issues of the climate emergency and the kind of actions that are needed to be taken to tackle that. But we're also facing an ecological emergency, sort of set in a backdrop of ongoing international and national biodiversity declines, included in London, where we continue to see species lost from the city, or conversely, the importance of some population species and their populations becoming increasingly valuable in London as they decline elsewhere. And the planning system has an important role in protecting nature, but also in London in recovering nature. So the London Plan provides strong protection to London's core sites for wildlife, known as sites of importance for nature conservation. And we have a map, it's a few years old here, taken from the London Environment Strategy of these sites. These are sinks, and there's about 1,600 across London, covering 20% of its surface area. And boroughs, through the plan, are required to identify these and also to protect them in planning decisions. But the plan also introduces a requirement for developments to aim to go further than protecting biodiversity and also satisfying the legal compliance issues that many of you will be familiar with, perhaps around bat roosts or breeding birds, for example, to actually look at how developments can deliver an overall benefit for wildlife, a biodiversity net gain. So this is covered in some detail in section 2.4 of the UGF guidance. And designing urban greening to meet the UGF targets to deliver wildlife benefit at the same time, there's an opportunity to deliver this biodiversity net gain. For many developments in London, they start with a low, what we call baseline level of biodiversity. So that is perhaps predominantly hard standing. They don't have many high quality habitats on them or features that are useful for wildlife. And in this case, the urban greening that is being provided to me, the UGF, creates some real opportunities through design choices to deliver more habitats for wildlife. And the guidance is clear that these habitats should be informed by the local context and look to local biodiversity priorities perhaps set out in biodiversity action plans, or where boroughs have produced some local nature recovery plans as part of green infrastructure strategies. And this roof here in this image on the left that we saw earlier, I think Sam, you spoke about this image in the context of the PVs, is also a really good example of how biodiversity features have been designed in. So the substrates used on the roof have been carefully selected to support the plants that have been chosen to grow on here. So they've used different types of substrate to create bands of vegetation across the roof. And they've also incorporated the larval food plant of a species that's a biodiversity action plan priority for the Olympic Park area here where this roof's set. So through these detailed design choices, they've created a really rich habitat that delivers space for PVs. It contributes to the wider SUDS approach of the scheme, but it's also providing new habitat for these species. This urban greening that's provided through the UGF can also be used as part of the design choices to avoid or mitigate impacts to existing habitats and species and to achieve an overall gain in wildlife value. So in this example here, this is a wetland that was created as part of a much larger housing development. And there were a number of notable either protected or biodiversity priority species on site, including water voles. So this wetland was created as part of the solution to mitigate impacts of the scheme on water vole and other wildlife, but it's also a really key component of how surface water is managed on the site. And so the flood management requirements have been met, and it forms part of the public open space of the site. And in cases where there are existing species or habitats of wildlife value, a priority for any new urban greening should be to help avoid or mitigate the impacts of the proposed development on biodiversity, as well as providing this locally relevant greening that complements the site's existing wildlife value. Sam ran through the RIBA stages earlier to highlight how important it is that urban greening is considered in the right way at the right point in the development process, and the same is true for ecology. And this is why the guidance also is clear that applicants need to ensure that preliminary ecological appraisal reports or other ecological impact assessments that are required for a site and commissioned go further than just pointing out, again, legal compliance issues and how impacts on existing wildlife can be avoided, to also highlight opportunities for urban greening to deliver biodiversity net gain so that these can be taken into account in the design process. And to help applicants and design teams consider the two issues of urban greening and biodiversity net gain together, we've published a design guide with London Wildlife Trust that starts to pull policy G5, which is the biodiversity and the urban greening policy, together with policy G6, which is biodiversity and access to nature in the plan. So part of how this is done is by looking in the guidance is by looking at the surface cover types that are set out in the London plan for the urban greening factor, which I've circled here, and considering the biodiversity potential of those different cover types, if they're designed with biodiversity in mind, or taking into account ecological principles and local priorities. And so the guidance sets out the biodiversity potential of each of the cover types in the UGF table and points to some design considerations for each of those cover types and provides further information in the document. I think what's important to point out here is that by and large, the highest scoring surface cover types in the UGF do tend to be those that are or can be designed to be more valuable for wildlife generally, but that isn't always true. For example, if you look here, standard trees are given a sort of low to moderate rating for biodiversity potential compared to extensive green roofs, which don't score quite as highly in the UGF, but have a lot more scope to be designed for wildlife in mind. We also include information in the document about how sort of approaches to public realm design and even building design can be considered to protect nature, but also to draw natural features into the development and extend and reconnect sort of local ecological networks. So in this example here, we have sort of a dark unlit railway corridor to the left of the image, which is also a site of importance for nature conservation. And some of the design options that are suggested here show about how retaining existing habitats and extending sort of habitats that are complementary to wildlife habitats in the adjacent sink out onto the site. How more formal areas of planting can reflect the natural characters of the adjacent sink to create sort of more formal public realm areas, but also in this case create a barrier to light pollution. And then also some choices that can be made about building layout and design, and in this case the buildings have been staggered back again to consider light pollution onto the sink, but also greening on the building reflects the local ecological character. So it's about drawing through those valuable habitats into the development so that they can sort of support the wildlife that is using the sink and extend and buffer this area. So a question then is, I've been talking about biodiversity net gain in the context of the London Plan. How does all this fit with mandatory biodiversity net gain that we're hearing about that's coming through the Environment Bill, which is soon to be enacted? So we know that mandatory biodiversity net gain that government are proposing will come into effect through amendments to the Town and Country Planning Act, and this will likely be law by 2023, and that this will require a 10% measurable gain from baseline vegetation on site. Government have provided a metric that can be used to calculate this baseline and the 10% change, and this will need to be used through any mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement. So like the UGF, it is a metric system, though they are fundamentally quite different because the UGF is measuring sort of the extent and quality of urban greening, whereas this approach is just focused on biodiversity. So they are quite different, but what we are seeing in schemes that are coming through already where the UGF is being used alongside mandatory biodiversity net gain is that because a lot of schemes in London start with quite a low baseline level of biodiversity as measured by a government's metric, that as long as the UGF is met and high quality greening is provided through that, that is a way to meet the 10% net gain requirement. So sort of the habitats that are provided to, or the greening rather, that's provided to meet the urban greening factor target scores also satisfies this new requirement that we're expecting to come through for mandatory biodiversity net gain. And I provide this example here. This is a scheme that scored a UGF score of 0.54, so well exceeded the 0.4 residential target, and it had been designed taking into account the local context. It's quite near a river corridor and a number of wildlife sites, but in an area that is really a gap in the local sort of green space and ecological network. So habitats were provided across the site that were of high quality, so lots of semi-natural vegetation, good quality green roofs and flower-rich perennial planting, and all of these kind of features score highly in government's biodiversity net gain metrics. So we find that the two work well together to provide different information about the type of greening that's being provided in the scheme. So I'll finish there talking about biodiversity and just move on to a reminder about sort of next steps with the consultation. It closes on the 20th of December, and the links provided here will take you through to our engagement portal, where you can sign up also to receive information about other London Plan Guidance consultations that are happening, and also go through to complete the online consultation for the UGF. We will send out the slide pack and links for everybody to be able to access this after the event today. So don't worry about having to capture these web addresses. We'll provide those to you. So I'm going to finish now and come out of the screen share, which hopefully might mean I can turn my camera on and see everybody.
Drum roll.
Yes. Sorry about the technical issues. It's hopefully that didn't.
It's always the way. Thanks both. Those presentations are great. I'm just going to turn to the Q&As that we have and pose you some questions. So the first one we have here: what is the relationship between the London Plan UGF and Berlin's biotope area factor? Sam D, I'm wondering if you can field that one. Yeah,
sure. So they're similar principles, but different. We did look at that approach. We did some evidence gathering as we were developing the policy, and part of that was looking to particularly where similar schemes have been used in Europe and North America. So it is a similar kind of approach, but designed to work in London. I think one thing that was clear from that we learned was that there needed to be enough difference within the scoring of the different cover types to promote quality. So they went back and refined their original policy there. So I can put a link in. Actually, I was going to put it in the chat, but because of tech, I think I might say I'll make sure it's included in the email that's sent out of the evidence reports that we've got for that, if you'd like to read some more about it.
Yeah, great. I think that would be really helpful. I'm going to take the next two questions together because I think they're related. So the initial question was, in regards to trees, how is area calculated with regard to habitat underneath, as it technically takes up the same area? And then there was a sort of follow up to that saying, although I understand diagrams are indicative, I would suggest not displaying the use of tree planting over wildflower meadows, as they are habitats that are mutually exclusive to each other with regard to shading, nutrient increasing, succession encouragement. So I think there's sort of a trees over other stuff issue. So Sam G, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a fair point on the second part of the question, but with regard to the question itself, the surface cover on the ground, as it were, is considered separately to the tree canopy. The tree canopy is measured in meters squared, so in plan view, looking down meters squared, whatever is underneath that is considered separately, and therefore including trees is a very good way to improve the UGF, because it essentially doubles up on that space, and that's how it's calculated.
Great, I think that's pretty clear. Let's just see. Okay, just another question, sort of a follow up to that, saying the examples are helpful, but I haven't had a chance to read the document, but several landscape architects have commented that it is still unclear exactly how to calculate tree area and canopy cover. Obviously, Sam's just explained how we consider it should be done, but obviously that's something we're out for consultation now. If people have suggestions on ways that we could clarify or improve the way that we describe that calculation, then obviously we'd welcome your feedback on how that could be done.
We can expand a little on that. It is recorded in the guidance, but essentially with regard to the calculation of trees, the canopy coverage is the forecast canopy at establishment, and that should be taken from a reputable source, which would typically be, in the case of a landscape architect, contacting a nursery, and the anticipated canopy coverage at establishment should be taken. It's accepted that that is there's a lot of assumption in that, depending on the soil conditions and the planting conditions, growth conditions. Canopy coverage will vary. It's taking a reputable source and having clear assumptions about how that has been calculated. And then we touched on it a little bit earlier, but there's two categories for trees: those in natural connected soils, scoring the higher score, and those in a tree pit where the soil volume is less than a third of that projected canopy. So soil volume in meters cubed, projected canopy in meters squared, where it's less than a third of a ratio. That then receives the lower score for trees. So I echo what you say, Leanne. If that's not clear in the guidance, then that can be flagged, and we would welcome that. But that's in a nutshell how it's calculated.
I think that probably there was a follow-up question again on the trees. I think that you possibly answered, but I'll ask it, and you can let me know if you've got anything more to add. So that works okay with trees, but at what age are they counted at as planted or as an expected size after X number of years? So I think you've probably covered that, but I don't know if there's anything more to say. Yeah, and there isn't that X number of years, and the X, as it were, isn't defined. As I say, when we have on that UGF drawing for approval in that assumptions column, that is a key assumption that should be listed. So it may be that all trees or these species have been assumed with this canopy coverage, and then with a reference to where that's been taken from or a justification. And as long as that's provided and they're reasonable assumptions, then that should be that's what's required for that submission. Okay, I'm just going to go with one more tree question while we're on it, because this has been the hot topic today. If tree canopies overlap, is the canopy counted twice, as they would be if they were separated? It could have a large multiplier effect.
I think it's probably, appreciate we've got lots of detailed questions about measuring here, because we've got people here who are having to measure, and that's you sort of need to have that tied down. But what we notice, and I think what's true for the UGF, is actually sort of an issue like that. You do those quite small meter squared areas don't make significant overall differences to the total UGF score. What makes big differences to the UGF score is getting the right classification of the greening type, and sort of these broad measurements for trees in particular, because they tend to be a sort of relatively lower area of the site. They sort of a few meter squared changes out of sort of the overall projected canopy doesn't actually seem to affect the total score that much because of how it's calculated. And I think in situations of one of the things about the UGF is that it's designed to be flexible, and we don't want to be too prescriptive in sort of the type, sort of specifying the types of cover that should be used. And we've tried to cover off as many of the common questions, like the most frequent questions we get about measurements in the guidance. So if there are, I think questions like that, it's really helpful to have them fed back. And if that's something that seems to be coming up a lot, we haven't seen that as an issue actually in referable applications to City Hall, or something that comes up very often. But if it's something that's causing a problem, or we sort of need to provide an answer on that, then to flag that in the consultation would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move away from trees for a moment. Another question here: has it been considered how EGF might be applied to large master plans where future RMA applications, reserve matters, not sure, may provide substantial greening, a park for example, but earlier phases are not meeting the target score?
I'm happy to take that one, Rhiannon. Yeah. So in the guidance we say that for reserve matter applications for large landscape schemes, each phase should meet the target in its own right. And we say that to make sure, there's a few reasons, partly to make sure that sort of, particularly on residential schemes, that earlier residents have sort of access to greening and that amenity, and also to make sure that the greening isn't all put into the last stage and ultimately sort of value engineered out of the project, or lost as perhaps requirements for a number of units increases over time, for example. But again, the UGF is flexible. Sam spoke quite a lot about rationale in the design and access statement and kind of showing your workings out. And I think on occasions where it makes most sense to have the landscape configured in a certain way, then that's a discussion for sort of an applicant and the planning authority to have. And there isn't any reason why, if that was the most sensible approach, that couldn't happen. But I think it's about having the right kind of agreements in place, or the confidence that that's going to be achieved. But as a principle, we recommend that each phase meets the target on its own merit.
Okay. Great. This is sort of not exactly related, but sort of on a similar sort of topic about calculating and what's included across the site more widely. Can essential infrastructure such as highways be excluded from the score total area, as they typically lower the score substantially?
Again, in the guidance, we say that they should be included, so it's everything within the red line boundary, and that sort of greening across the rest of the site, or where it's possible to come to an agreement about greening on land that isn't sort of owned by the applicant, can be maximised. And again, this is a case, I think, where it needs to be sort of the workings out shown to show how greening has been tried to be maximised, but it hasn't been possible. And that's all comes back to the UGF again being a tool and not sort of a tool for that kind of discussion.
Mm-hmm. Great. On a different topic, is the JLA the authority for producing a local nature recovery plan, what you talked about in para 2.4.1?
We don't know is the answer to that. So probably it's likely we will be. We'll find out sort of late spring, early summer next year, because the Secretary of State will appoint the responsible authority for that. But I think it's likely it will be the Mayor.
Great, thank you. Some of these questions here. So it seems detailed landscape plans with details of tree pits is required prior to planning permission being granted to be able to know what soil volumes will be. This level of detail is usually requested as a planning condition, so it will need to be flagged up to development management officers. So I suppose it's just a question about like the level of detail that we're expecting at planning stage to be able to determine the scores. Not so much of a question, but any comments on that?
I'll just say that the probably even more extreme example is outline schemes where everything would be yet to be detailed or even designed to any level of detail. And in that situation, we would ask that the UGF is calculated on the illustrative scheme, obviously within the parameters of the outline scheme. And again, those assumptions are clearly listed. And so taking the example of the tree pits, accepting that they may not be designed fully at that stage, you'll be making those assumptions and listing those. And as long as they are reasonable and communicated, then there's no reason that should cause any problems.
Okay, yeah, great. We've got quite a lot of sort of technical points here about measurements. I'll give you one more on about the measurement of green walls. How are green walls measured? Presumably vertical surface area. Intensively planted walls are very different to climbers in terms of coverage, biodiversity, and surely different multipliers should be used. Trees only seem to be measured horizontally, yet they obviously have a vertical element. So yeah, just a bit about how we account for green walls.
Shall I carry on with that one? Yeah, I mean, green walls are, so there is only one category for green walls. So accepting that there is a variety in systems, and particularly between ground rooted systems and wall mounted systems, that they do achieve a score of 0.6, and therefore obviously just over kind of in the upper half, just about. So it's a bit of a middle ground. So it covers quite a breadth of different green walls. But again, accepting that a mounted system should have a more immediate effect, and climbers are going to take longer to establish. Again, it's about what is the intent and making sure that the management and the maintenance plan sets out that the intent is to cover that area, then it's accepted that these things take time to mature. And that is perfectly reasonable to allow for that time in the UGF calculation. The trees, yeah, again, I think it slightly goes back to a point that Sam made earlier around how sensitive is the UGF to variations, and the fact that it is a tool. So the targets have been set on the scores provided, and through testing that has been proven to be reasonable and achievable, and therefore it's not trying to capture every possible contributing piece of the area to meet that overall target. Is very much a tool to inform that discussion. So I think it's a bit of a rambling answer, isn't it? But the point is that it's not trying to be more sophisticated. The emphasis is to keep it simple, so that it can very much be used to inform that design development, be revisited in an iterative process, and inform that discussion between applicants and authorities. So simplicity is a key driver of the UGF.
Yeah, great. Another question here. I guess it's probably again related to sort of the sort of balance between detail and simplicity, and the different people that need to interact with the UGF assessment. But plants requiring a certain amount of sunlight will not survive or thrive beneath trees. Not all development management officers will have this knowledge. For example, it would not seem reasonable to have flower-rich perennials or meadow beneath trees. This probably would not be questioned by many officers. More information in the guidance would be helpful. Okay, I don't know if you want to make any comment on, on that side of things.
Yeah, perhaps you might be better off maybe to just well, I've got a few thoughts, but Rhiannon as well, just thinking about what we can include in London Plan Guidance as well, partly. So it isn't a design guide. We can only publish, because it's a sort of a document that we're producing that's got a very clear format. It can only include information on how to implement the policy, and that's one of the reasons that we produced that separate design guide around biodiversity with London Wildlife Trust. So I don't think we would be able to go into that level of design guide detail in the London Plan Guidance. I think it's a good point. I don't think the UGF causes that issue. I think that's always true, that development management officers rather don't have the skills all the time and capacity to interpret and sort of quality assure landscape plans or sort of ecological proposals. The UGF doesn't change that. It's just as it is, I think, unfortunately, at the moment with capacity. So there is a section in the guidance around boroughs setting their own targets, and I think some boroughs are starting to look at promoting certain types of greening being used, and their own sort of more local information that applicants can use when they're delivering the UGF. And that's a sort of one way to look at it. But yeah, I share your concern there, but I don't think that's something we can really address in detail in the guidance, unfortunately.
So I think the next question's sort of related in a way, and it's about, it's maybe not necessarily an issue for the UGF alone, but of landscaping and these kind of issues that have historically existed anyway. But how we suggest conditions or Section 106 agreements and eventual monitoring or enforcement might be used to make sure developments adhere to the proposed UGF and its maintenance and management.
Yeah, Sam, if you want to
took an intake of breath.
Pick that one up.
I can only start, Sam. I mean, I think first of all, I think that's a good question that I haven't got a full answer to, but I would say that a key thing in considering the UGF as part of an application is that also comparing it to the landscape and ecological management plan submitted with a scheme, making sure that at planning that management, maintenance and perhaps replacement of species within the 5-year establishment period is committed to within the scheme. I appreciate that's not answering how do we monitor that going forwards, and I think that's that's a bigger question of planning, in my opinion. But I think the application should provide the determining authority with as much confidence as they reasonably can, to do with the intended surface cover types, that they will be seen through that ongoing management and maintenance. So embedding as much of that in the plan as you can at planning would give that confidence to a reasonable level, I would say, at planning.
Anything to add there? No, so I'm happy with that. Yeah,
Yes.
great. I'm just going to ask another question we've got here. So if greening that's already on site counts towards the UGF score, then does that mean that some developers are having to do less than others?
Well, the UGF isn't a protection policy as such, so it sits within a wider green infrastructure chapter in the London Plan, and that, so I touched on one of the policies there, the protection of sink policy, but there's also policies that protect the green belt, metropolitan open land, trees of high value, including sort of ancient woodlands and veteran trees. So all of those policies have to be satisfied, as well as the UGF. So it is feasible that in some cases sites may come forward that don't have sort of those existing protected elements on them, but that may have some green cover already, in which case the UGF promotes retention of those, if sort of that existing green infrastructures of good enough quality. So it could be viewed, I think, perhaps that way, that sort of if you're starting with a green site, it's easier, but actually there's also all the other policy requirements that have to be met. And I think importantly, sort of meeting the UGF, so putting a submission in that shows you've met the UGF score doesn't necessarily mean that the policy requirements around protecting biodiversity or open space have been met. So they have to be considered as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another one here, just coming back to the biodiversity net gain metric. Why are the UGF and biodiversity net gain surface types not the same?
They're fundamentally different things. For a start, I think it's probably the simplest answer. So the biodiversity net gain metric looks through sort of a lens of habitats and biodiversity habitats and the way that they're classified, sort of in existing ecological surveys, for example. The UGF surface cover types are set out based on broadly the ability of that surface cover type to absorb and attenuate water as a proxy of naturalness. There's, I think, can't quite remember how many surface cover types there are in the UGF. I think perhaps 16 surface cover types, but in the biodiversity net gain metric, there's tens and tens of them, because it splits them down to quite different sort of different surface types. So in the UGF, for example, we have all semi-natural habitats score 1, whereas in the biodiversity net gain metric different types of habitats, semi-natural habitat, are listed. So they're fundamentally different tools trying to do different things.
Mm-hmm. Great. I've got another question about what guidance is available for creating UGF target scores for different types of development. What would be a good practice approach for typically hard landscapes such as streets or squares, where it's difficult to meet a high UGF such as 0.4 for residential developments? So I guess this is going on to where we're asking boroughs to set UGF targets. You know, what does the guidance say about approaching that?
Do you want to start, Stephen?
Okay.
Yeah, or and it may be, and please add a clarification to the question if I'm misinterpreting it, because it may also be that that's in reference to setting a UGF target for a specific application, possibly.
Yes, you're quite right.
As we touched on earlier. And I think the answer is yes, it would be harder to meet the UGF with a very a predominantly hard landscape scheme. And in essence, that is a driving force of the UGF, is to encourage more soft and permeable and vegetated areas, and therefore if there was a requirement for a substantial area of hard landscape within a scheme, that would be one of those key considerations that we would really look to be acknowledged at the beginning of a scheme, to set out those parameters to then say how much harder things like green roofs and green walls, or whatever it may be, higher quality surface cover types will need to be embedded to offset the space lost by that extensive area of hard landscape. So yeah, that hopefully goes part way to answer the question. If it is more towards the different use classes, then the London plan, it has the 0.4 for residential, 0.3 for commercial, and then it's worth noting that industrial applications are not required to meet a set UGF, but they are required to submit a UGF and still demonstrate compliance with policy G5, i.e. demonstrate how urban greening has been included as a fundamental element of design, but they just don't have that set UGF target to be met in the same way as residential and commercial schemes.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Looking at, there's a few questions here that are still outstanding that are related to, I think, quite technical measurement issues, and I think it would be easy to, we could spend all afternoon looking at the minutiae of that. So I think I'm going to draw this to a close, but I would say, you know, any of the comments that you have, however detailed, do feed those back to us through the consultation. We've got a survey on our webpage on the engagement portal that we'd really welcome feedback on. So thank you everyone for attending today. Thanks for the presents. Thanks for all the presentation. If you want to give me presents too, then that's fine. Thank you everyone. Bye.